the bonds that break and bind. The first time it happened, I thought I had misheard. My wife, Elena, stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she recounted the conversation she'd had with my mother earlier that day. I could see the strain on her face, the confusion in her eyes, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle she wished didn't exist. She said, "What?" I asked, my voice low and cautious, unsure if I even wanted to hear it again. She suggested, Elena began, her words hesitant as if they might shatter something fragile, that I find someone else. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the walls themselves had recoiled in shock. My mother was not a woman given to subtlety, but this was unimaginable. She said you were too wrapped up in your work, Elena continued, her voice trembling, that you didn't give me enough attention, that it would be understandable if I looked elsewhere. I stood frozen, caught between disbelief and a growing storm of anger. My mother, the matriarch of my family, had always been a force to be reckoned with, strong, opinionated, sometimes overbearing. But this was something else entirely. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. My mother had always had a complicated relationship with Elena. When we first started dating, she had been cordial, polite even. But as our relationship grew more serious, her disapproval began to seep through in subtle jabs and veiled criticisms. Elena was too independent, too modern, too different from the image my mother had always had for the perfect daughter-in-law. I thought time would soften her stance, that she would come to see the woman I loved as I did. But it seemed that time had only deepened her resolve, her need to control the narrative of my life. The following weeks were a test of endurance. Elena was torn between her loyalty to me and the discomfort of knowing that my own mother had planted a seed of doubt in our marriage. And I found myself in a maelstrom of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness I couldn't quite articulate. I decided to confront my mother. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed to understand why. When I arrived at her house, the air between us was tense. She greeted me with her usual warmth, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a knowledge that I was not there for a casual visit. "I spoke to Elena," I said, skipping the pleasantries. My mother's expression remained neutral. "And?" "She told me what you said to her, about finding someone else." Her face hardened, her hands folding in her lap. "I did it for you," she said, her tone resolute. "You're so focused on your career, Michael. You barely have time for her. I see the way she looks when you're not around. Lonely, unfulfilled. I was only trying to help." "To help?" I echoed, my voice rising. "By suggesting my wife cheat on me?" "I didn't tell her to cheat," she snapped. "I told her to think about her happiness, and maybe, if you can't give her what she needs, she should find it elsewhere." Her words hit me like a blow. I stared at her, struggling to process the depth of her interference. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you know what you've done? You've sown doubt where there was none. You've put a wedge between us." "I was protecting you," she insisted, her voice unwavering. "You've always put too much into your work. I didn't want you to lose her because you were too blind to see what she needs." That night, I returned home feeling more lost than ever. Elena was waiting for me, her eyes searching mine for some sign of what had transpired. I told her everything. My mother's justification, her twisted logic, her belief that she was acting in my best interest. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We hold on to what we have," I said, taking her hands in mine. "We don't let her or anyone come between us." Elena nodded, but I could see the lingering doubt in her eyes, the shadow of my mother's words still hanging over her. It would take time to heal, to rebuild the trust that had been shaken, but I was determined. This was my marriage, my life, and I would not let anyone dictate its course. In the end, my relationship with my mother was forever altered. I set boundaries, made it clear that her interference was unacceptable. It wasn't easy. She was a proud woman, set in her ways. But it was necessary. For Elena and me, it was a turning point. We learned to communicate more openly, to address the cracks before they could deepen. And while the scars of my mother's betrayal remained, they became a reminder of the strength we had found in each other. The bonds that break can also bind, if only we have the courage to mend them. And in the end, that's what saved us. Not vengeance, not anger, but the quiet resilience of love. Revenge for betrayal. The reckoning. Charlotte stood at the edge of the cliff, the cold wind whipping her hair as the crashing waves below mirrored the turmoil within her. Months had passed since she unleashed her plan of revenge against Edward and her mother Beatrice for their unforgivable betrayal. Yet for all her efforts, satisfaction remained elusive, replaced by a hollow ache that gnawed at her soul. She had meticulously crafted Edward's downfall, exposing his affair, sabotaging his business, and ensuring he became a pariah in the town of Vailshire. Beatrice, once a respected figure, had been ostracized, her dignity shattered by the whispers and judgment of those she once called friends. Charlotte had thought vengeance would be her salvation, but instead, it had become her prison. One evening, as the winter sun set in a blaze of orange and crimson, a letter arrived at Charlotte's door. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Beatrice's. With trembling hands, Charlotte opened it, her heart pounding as she read the words. Charlotte, I know I've wronged you in ways that words cannot mend. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know the truth. Meet me at the old chapel tomorrow at sunset. Please. Beatrice Charlotte's first instinct was to ignore it, to cast the letter into the fire and let the flames consume it along, with the remnants of her trust. But something about Beatrice's plea struck a chord. She was hesitant, but curiosity and a flicker of hope propelled her forward. The chapel was a forgotten relic of Vailshire's past, its once grand facade now cloaked in ivy and decay. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cracked stone walls as Charlotte approached. Beatrice was already there, standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the dim light inside. You came, Beatrice said softly, her voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. Charlotte folded her arms, her expression cold. Say what you have to say, and then we're done. Beatrice nodded, her eyes downcast. I owe you an explanation. What Edward and I did, was wrong. There's no excuse for the pain we caused you. But you need to understand, it wasn't about you. It was about us, about the things we thought we were missing in our lives. Charlotte scoffed, her anger bubbling to the surface. Missing? You had everything, respect, family, love, and you threw it all away. For what? A fleeting affair? Beatrice flinched but stood her ground. You're right. It was selfish. I thought I was searching for something to fill the emptiness inside me, but I only created more emptiness, and I lost you in the process. That's something I will never forgive myself for. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Do you think this makes it better? That your guilt somehow erases what you did? No, Beatrice said quietly. But maybe it's a start. As Beatrice's words lingered in the air, Charlotte felt the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. She had dedicated herself to revenge, but in doing so, she had become a mirror of the very people she despised. Her relentless pursuit of justice had cost her peace, and the satisfaction she sought had turned to ashes. I didn't want to hurt you, Beatrice continued, but I see now that my actions were unforgivable. Still, I needed to tell you the truth, to face you, and admit my mistakes. Charlotte turned away, her gaze fixed on the fading horizon. She wanted to cling to her anger, to the fire that had fueled her for so long. But in the quiet of the chapel, with Beatrice's broken confession hanging between them, she felt something begin to shift. "Do you regret it?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. Every moment, every choice. For the first time in months, Charlotte felt the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. She didn't know if she could forgive, not yet, but she realized that holding on to her anger was only keeping her chained to the pain. In the days that followed, Charlotte began to rebuild her life. She focused on the things she had neglected in her quest for revenge, her own happiness, her own dreams. She started to let go of the bitterness that had consumed her, replacing it with a quiet resolve to move forward. Edward, too, was on a path of reckoning. The weight of his choices had left him a shadow of the man he once was, but he was determined to make amends. He reached out to Charlotte, not to seek forgiveness, but to acknowledge his mistakes and the harm he had caused. "I don't expect us to ever be the same," he said one day, standing on her doorstep, "but I hope someday you can find it in your heart to let go of the anger, not for me, but for yourself." Charlotte didn't respond right away, but his words stayed with her. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had been done, it was about freeing herself from the chains of the past. Revenge for betrayal. The final chapter. Charlotte stood at the edge of her garden, her fingers brushing the petals of the white lilies she had planted months ago, a symbol of purity and renewal, or so she had hoped. But renewal had been elusive. Her revenge had been as meticulously executed as the rows of flowers before her, and yet, as the months passed, it felt as though she had been tending a garden of thorns. Edward and Beatrice had been broken by her actions, their lives unraveled. Like poorly woven threads, Edward's business had collapsed under the weight of the scandals she exposed, and Beatrice, once a beacon of respect in Valeshire, had fled the town in shame. And yet, the satisfaction she had expected had turned to ash. Her victory felt hollow. 1. Rainy evening. As the storm outside mirrored her inner turmoil, there was a knock at the door. When Charlotte opened it, she found Edward standing there, soaked to the bone. His face was pale, his expression raw with emotion. "Charlotte," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I need to talk to you." Charlotte hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed to shut the door, to banish him from her life forever. But the vulnerability in his eyes made her pause. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Edward stood in the parlor, dripping, water onto the hardwood floor. "I've lost everything," he began, his voice cracking. "My business, my reputation, my family, and I have no one to blame but myself." Charlotte crossed her arms, her expression cold. "What do you expect me to say? That I'm sorry? That I regret what I did? You deserved every bit of it." "I know," Edward said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I betrayed you, and I deserve the consequences, but I came here to ask for something. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just closure." Charlotte's breath hitched. Closure. The word carried a weight she wasn't prepared to face. "Why now?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. Edward looked up. His eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in years. Sincerity. "Because I can't move forward if I don't face the pain I caused you. And I can't live with myself if I don't at least try to make things right, even if it's just by acknowledging how deeply I hurt you." The conversation that followed was raw and unfiltered. Edward admitted to his mistakes, laying bare the insecurities and weaknesses that had led to his betrayal. Charlotte listened, her anger simmering beneath the surface. But for the first time, she also felt a pang of understanding. When Edward left, the house felt emptier than ever. But in the silence, Charlotte found herself reflecting on his words. Revenge had given her power, but it hadn't healed her wounds. If anything, it had deepened them, anchoring her in a cycle of pain. Days turned to weeks, and Charlotte found herself drawn to the old chapel where she had last spoken to Beatrice. The town's whispers had quieted, but the scars of betrayal lingered. When she arrived, she found Beatrice sitting on one of the crumbling pews, her posture weary. "I didn't think you'd come," Beatrice said, her voice heavy with regret. Charlotte sat down beside her, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. "Neither did I," she admitted. For hours they spoke, not as adversaries, but as two women who had both been broken by the choices they had made. Beatrice didn't ask for forgiveness, and Charlotte didn't offer it. But in their shared vulnerability, they found a sliver of understanding. As spring arrived, the garden outside Charlotte's home began to bloom. The lilies, once symbols of a peace she thought she'd never find, now stood as a testament to her resilience. Edward left Valeshire, seeking a fresh start in a place where his name wasn't tied to scandal. Beatrice, too, chose to rebuild her life, taking steps to mend the relationships she had damaged. And Charlotte? She chose a different kind of revenge, a quiet, unspoken one. She would not let the betrayal define her. She would not let anger consume her. Instead, she would live fully, embracing the beauty and pain of life in equal measure. The greatest revenge, she realized, was not destruction, but liberation, letting go of the chains of the past and walking forward, unburdened. And in that liberation, Charlotte found something she thought she had lost forever: peace. Revenge for betrayal. The unforgiving path Charlotte thought she had buried her past, its pain, its chaos, beneath the ruins of her enemies. Edward was gone, Beatrice disgraced, and the world she had known torn down brick by brick. But the ashes of betrayal have a way of clinging, and the darkness she'd embraced to exact her revenge now shadowed her every step. Her victory wasn't the closure she'd imagined. The satisfaction she sought had turned bitter, and as the days passed, she realized vengeance hadn't freed her. It had ensnared her in a web of emptiness and regret. One evening, a letter arrived. Its seal was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. She hesitated before opening it, bracing herself for the contents. "Charlotte, I know you won't believe me, but I had to write. I need to understand why. You've taken everything from me, and I can't move on without answers. Meet me at the old wharf tomorrow at dusk. Just one conversation, no tricks." Edward Charlotte stared at the words, her hands trembling. Why should she meet him? What more could he possibly want? But beneath her skepticism was a curiosity she couldn't ignore. The wharf was quiet when she arrived, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. Edward stood at the edge, his figure illuminated by the amber glow of the setting sun. He turned as she approached, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. "You came," he said, his voice strained. "Say what you need to say," Charlotte replied coldly, keeping her distance. Edward sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I've spent every waking moment trying to piece together why you did this. I know I wronged you. I deserve the fallout. But Beatrice, the business, you didn't just destroy me. You obliterated everything. Why?" Charlotte's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Because you both deserved it. You betrayed me in the worst possible way, and she was supposed to protect me, not take what was mine. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" "I didn't think," Edward began, then stopped, shaking his head. "No, you're right. I didn't think. But Charlotte, this wasn't justice. This was annihilation. And now you're as broken as the rest of us." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare turn this on me. You made your choices, Edward. You and Beatrice brought this on yourselves. Maybe, he said, stepping closer. But have you looked at yourself lately? Really looked? You're consumed by this. Revenge didn't heal you. It made you colder, emptier. Is that the life you want? Edward's words struck a nerve Charlotte didn't know was still raw. She had spent months justifying her actions, convincing herself that vengeance was her right, her solace. But now, standing face to face with the man she had destroyed, she couldn't ignore the truth. She wasn't whole. "I don't need your pity," she said, her voice wavering. "It's not pity," Edward replied. "It's regret. For what I did. For what we became. And for what this has turned you into." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Then Edward turned and walked away, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts. That night, Charlotte sat in her study staring at the remnants of her life, the photographs, the memories, the pieces of a world that no longer existed. She thought of Edward's words, of the emptiness that had crept into her heart. And for the first time, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for what she had lost, but for what she had become. The next morning, she made a decision. Charlotte began to dismantle the fortress of isolation she had built around herself. She reached out to Beatrice, not for reconciliation, but for closure. Their conversation was tense, fraught with unspoken pain, but it marked a step toward understanding. She sold the house she had shared with Edward, the walls of which bore too many scars. She left Vailshire, seeking a fresh start in a place where her name wasn't tied to whispers of revenge. Over time, Charlotte found solace not in forgetting but in rebuilding. She volunteered, traveled, and rediscovered parts of herself she thought had been lost to the shadows of betrayal. And while she never forgot the pain of the past, she learned to carry it differently, not as a weight, but as a reminder of her resilience. Years later, in a quiet coastal town far from Vailshire, Charlotte opened a small bookstore. Its sign read, "Second Chances," a name that reflected her journey. Customers came and went, often remarking on the warmth of the shop and the kindness of its owner, unaware of the tempest she had endured. And though the scars of betrayal remained, Charlotte found peace in the simple act of turning pages. Each one a reminder that even the darkest stories could lead to a new chapter. Revenge for betrayal. The legacy of shadows. Charlotte thought leaving Vailshire would sever her ties to the past. The quiet coastal town where she had built her new life felt like a sanctuary at first. But as the years passed, echoes of her vengeance began to resurface in unexpected ways. A letter, a familiar face in the crowd, a name spoken in passing, remnants of the life she had left behind kept intruding, as if the past refused to let her go. One such day, as she tended to her small bookstore, a customer entered who seemed oddly familiar. The man was older, with streaks of gray in his hair, but his sharp blue eyes bore a striking resemblance to someone she once knew. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice calm but deliberate. He picked up a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo from the display table. "An apt choice, don't you think?" Charlotte froze. The title wasn't just a coincidence, it was a deliberate message. Her heart pounded as she looked at the man again, and then it hit her. He was Nathan, Edward's younger brother, whom she hadn't seen in years. "What do you want, Nathan?" she asked, her tone guarded. He smiled faintly, setting the book down. "I've been looking for you. Edward asked me to." Charlotte's expression hardened. "Why? So he can lecture me again about how my revenge made me as bad as him? I don't have time for his guilt." Nathan shook his head. "Edward's dead." The words hit her like a thunderclap. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Edward? Dead? She had imagined many fates for him, But this wasn't one she had considered. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Heart attack," Nathan said. 2 months ago. He'd been struggling for years, financially, emotionally. He left a letter for you." Nathan reached into his coat and handed her a sealed envelope. Her name was scrawled across it in Edward's unmistakable handwriting. She hesitated before taking it, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. "Why didn't he send it himself?" she asked. "He didn't know where you were," Nathan replied. "But he told me to find you. Said it was important." That night, Charlotte sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the unopened letter. A storm raged outside, the howling wind a mirror of the turmoil within her. Finally, with trembling hands, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. "Charlotte, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I don't know if that brings you peace or pain, but either way, I hope you'll hear me out. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened between us, trying to understand how we both became people we didn't recognize. I was a coward, Charlotte. I hurt you because I couldn't face my own failures. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. You were right to seek justice. I won't argue that. But justice turned into vengeance, and vengeance turned into destruction. For both of us. I see that now, too late to make things right. But I don't want my mistakes to define your life. You're stronger than I ever was, Charlotte. You survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss. And you're still standing. Don't let the darkness consume you like it did me. Live, Charlotte. Truly live. Find the happiness you deserve. Goodbye." Edward's tears blurred her vision as she read the final words. For all the pain Edward had caused her, his letter was a stark reminder of the humanity they both shared. Flawed, fragile, and desperately seeking redemption. In the days that followed, Charlotte found herself reflecting not on Edward's betrayal, but on the choices she had made in response. She had thought her revenge would bring her closure, but instead, it had tethered her to the very people she wanted to escape. For the first time, she began to consider what it might mean to truly let go, not just of Edward and Beatrice, but of the anger and bitterness that had defined her for so long. Months later, Charlotte returned to Vailshire. The town had changed in her absence, yet it still held the memories of a life she had left behind. She visited the old chapel, now in ruins, and placed Edward's letter on the altar. "This is my last goodbye," she whispered. She left the chapel, feeling lighter, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. Charlotte's story didn't end with forgiveness or reconciliation. It ended with a choice, a decision to step out of the shadows of betrayal and into the light of a future she could shape for herself. And as she walked away from the chapel, the wind carrying the scent of spring blossoms, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Title: Revenge for Betrayal. Shadows of Redemption. Charlotte had imagined her return to Vailshire would be the final chapter of her journey, a symbolic gesture to bury the past and reclaim her future. But life has a way of pulling you back into the stories you thought were over. Weeks after leaving Edward's letter in the ruined chapel, she received a package at her bookstore. It was plain and unmarked, save for her name written in neat handwriting. Inside was an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. Tucked into the first page was a note. "Charlotte, there's more you need to know. This belonged to Beatrice. I think it's time you learned the truth." Nathan, her breath caught. Beatrice. The name was a phantom, a ghost that still haunted her, despite the years and miles she had put between them. Why would Nathan send her this? What truth could Beatrice's journal possibly hold? That evening, by the soft glow of a lamp, Charlotte opened the journal. The first few entries were mundane, filled with daily musings and gossip. But as she read further, the tone shifted. March 12th. Edward thinks I don't notice his late nights or the way he avoids my questions, but I know he's hiding something big. April 8th. Charlotte is too kind, too trusting. She doesn't see what's happening right under her nose. But I can't bring myself to tell her. How do you destroy someone's world? May 21st, I confronted him. I told him I knew about the money, about the lies. He begged me to stay quiet, said he was trying to protect her. Protect her? He's the one tearing her apart. The entries painted a picture Charlotte hadn't expected. Beatrice hadn't been the willing accomplice she had imagined. Instead, she had been trapped in a web of deceit and manipulation, just like Charlotte. And then came the final entry. June 15th. I've made my decision. I can't keep this secret any longer, even if it means losing everything. Charlotte deserves to know the truth. Edward will hate me for it, but I can't live with this guilt. Tomorrow, I'll tell her everything. But Charlotte never received that confession. The next day, Beatrice had vanished from Valeshire, leaving only rumors in her wake. The journal changed everything. It forced Charlotte to confront the complexity of the betrayal she had endured. Beatrice wasn't just a villain. She was a victim, someone who had tried and failed to do the right thing. For days, Charlotte wrestled with this new perspective. She had spent years vilifying Beatrice, channeling her pain into a vengeance that had left them both scarred. But now, she wondered, had she been too blind to see the truth? Determined to find closure, Charlotte sought out Nathan. They met in a small cafe in Valeshire, their conversation laced with tension and unspoken questions. "Why did you send me this?" Charlotte asked, holding up the journal. "Because you needed to know," Nathan said simply. "Beatrice wasn't perfect, but she wasn't the monster you made her out to be. She cared about you, even if she made mistakes." Charlotte clenched her jaw. "She could have told me the truth. Instead, she disappeared." "She was scared," Nathan said. "Edward threatened her, Charlotte. He said if she told you, he'd ruin her life. And he meant it." The weight of Nathan's words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had spent so long viewing the world in black and white, dividing people into heroes and villains. But the truth was far messier. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte tracked down Beatrice. She found her living in a small town, working as a teacher. Their reunion was awkward, fraught with the baggage of their shared past. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," Beatrice said, her voice trembling. "Neither did I," Charlotte admitted. "But I read your journal. I know you tried to tell me the truth." Beatrice looked away, tears pooling in her eyes. "I wanted to, Charlotte. But Edward, he made it impossible. I thought disappearing would protect you. I see now how wrong I was." Charlotte nodded, the ache in her chest both familiar and foreign. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can stop letting it control us." Their conversation didn't erase the pain or undo the damage, but it marked the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for: healing. Charlotte returned to her life in the coastal town, her heart a little lighter. She still carried the scars of betrayal, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as a reminder of her strength and resilience, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, not for revenge, but for peace. Revenge for betrayal. The final reckoning months passed after Charlotte's conversation with Beatrice. Their meeting had offered clarity, but not complete closure. As Charlotte tried to rebuild her life in the coastal town, fragments of the past continued to resurface, each one demanding her attention. The journal had opened a door to questions she hadn't known she still needed answers to. Why had Edward risked everything? Who else had been complicit in his schemes? And most importantly, could she ever truly put the past to rest? One day, as Charlotte was organizing her bookstore, she received another unexpected visitor. Nathan, walked in, his face marked by a mix of determination and unease. "We need to talk," he said. Charlotte's heart sank. "What now?" Nathan handed her a folder. "This came to me through one of Edward's old contacts. I think it's time you saw it." The folder contained documents, bank statements, contracts, and letters detailing a tangled web of deceit that stretched far beyond what Charlotte had imagined. Edward hadn't acted alone. He had been part of a larger conspiracy involving corrupt investors and a shadowy figure named Victor Langston, a man with a reputation for exploiting vulnerable businesses. Charlotte's bookstore had been one of their targets, its success a threat to a larger development project they had planned for Valeshire. Edward's betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been part of a calculated move to dismantle her business and pave the way for Langston's ambitions. This is bigger than I thought," Charlotte said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Nathan nodded. "I thought you deserved to know. Langston's still out there, Charlotte, and he's still pulling strings." The revelation reignited a fire within Charlotte, but it wasn't the same consuming rage that had driven her initial quest for revenge. This was different. It was a call to justice, not for herself, but for the countless others Langston had, likely wronged. Charlotte contacted a trusted attorney, Elise Marks, who had a reputation for taking on powerful adversaries. Together, they began piecing together a case against Langston, using the documents Nathan had provided as their foundation. Their investigation uncovered more than they had anticipated: fraudulent land acquisitions, embezzlement, and a trail of ruined lives left in Langston's wake. As they delved deeper, they realized they weren't just fighting for Charlotte's redemption, but for justice on a grander scale. Months turned into a year as Charlotte and Elise built their case. The journey was fraught with challenges, threats. From Langston's associates, legal roadblocks, and the emotional toll of revisiting the pain of betrayal. But through it all, Charlotte found strength in her purpose. The trial, when it finally began, became a spectacle. Langston's team of high-powered lawyers tried to discredit Charlotte and her evidence, painting her as a vindictive woman seeking attention. But Elise was relentless, and Charlotte's testimony was raw and compelling. "I lost everything because of Edward's betrayal," she said on the stand, her voice steady. "But what I've learned is that betrayal doesn't just destroy individuals, it erodes trust, communities, and justice itself. That's what Victor Langston has done, and that's why I'm here." The courtroom fell silent as the jury deliberated. Hours passed before the verdict was read. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Langston's conviction marked a turning point not just for Charlotte, but for the countless others he had wronged. The media hailed her as a hero, but Charlotte dismissed the accolades. She hadn't done it for fame or recognition. She had done it to reclaim her story and to ensure that others wouldn't suffer as she had. In the aftermath of the trial, Charlotte returned to her bookstore. It had become a symbol of resilience, a sanctuary where she could heal and help others find solace in the power of stories. Beatrice visited one afternoon, their relationship now one of cautious friendship. "You did it," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "We did it," Charlotte corrected. The two women sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared past no longer a burden but a bond. Charlotte's journey wasn't one of forgiveness or forgetting. It was one of transformation. She had faced the shadows of betrayal and emerged stronger, not because she had sought vengeance, but because she had chosen justice. And as she looked out at the sea from her small coastal town, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Shadows of betrayal. Charlotte thought she had put the past behind her. After the long battle for justice and her reconciliation with her own inner demons, she believed life would finally settle into the quiet simplicity she craved. Her bookstore thrived and her relationship with those around her grew stronger. But shadows have a way of returning, often from the most unexpected places. One evening, as she closed the shop, she found herself alone in the quiet streets of the coastal town. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the sea. As she locked the door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The message was from Beatrice. "We need to talk. It's about Edward's past, and someone else who may still be in danger." Charlotte frowned. Beatrice's tone was cryptic, and though they had mended some of the rifts between them, the lingering scars of betrayal meant trust was slow to build. She met Beatrice the next day at a cafe. Beatrice was visibly anxious, her hands trembling, as she pushed a folder across the table. "It's happening again," Beatrice said, her voice barely a whisper. Charlotte opened the folder. Inside were photos and documents. They showed a pattern of deceit that mirrored her own past. A man named Richard Harper, a local business owner, was being targeted by a woman he trusted, his wife. At first, Charlotte was reluctant to get involved. The pain of her own betrayal still lingered, and she wasn't eager to reopen old wounds. But as she read through the details Beatrice had gathered, something struck her. The woman orchestrating the deceit wasn't just anyone. It was someone from her own past, someone she had thought she would never see again. It was Mia, Edward's former mistress and accomplice. "Mia's not just breaking his heart," Beatrice said. "She's using him, just like she used Edward. She's setting him up to take the fall for a scheme that will leave him bankrupt. Sound familiar?" Charlotte's hands clenched into fists. She hasn't changed. Determined to stop Mia before she ruined another life, Charlotte reached out to Richard under the guise of a potential business collaboration. They met at his cafe, where she carefully broached the topic of his wife. She's not who you think she is," Charlotte said cautiously. Richard was defensive at first, unwilling to believe that the woman he loved could betray him. But as Charlotte presented the evidence, his resolve began to waver. "I trusted her," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought we were building something real." Charlotte's heart ached at his pain, a reflection of her own not so long ago. "I know what it feels like," she said softly. "But you have a chance to stop this before it destroys you." Together, they devised a plan to confront Mia. Charlotte's experience with Edward's schemes proved invaluable as they uncovered the full extent of Mia's plot. She had been siphoning funds from Richard's business into offshore accounts, preparing to disappear once the company collapsed under fabricated debts. The confrontation was explosive. Mia denied everything at first, but as the evidence mounted, her facade crumbled. "You think you're better than me?" Mia sneered at Charlotte. "You've spent your whole life chasing revenge. At least I'm honest about who I am." Charlotte met her gaze calmly. "Honesty would have meant admitting the damage you caused. Instead, you keep repeating the same mistakes." Mia's schemes were exposed, and Richard was able to reclaim control of his business. Though the betrayal left him scarred, he found solace in knowing he had allies who understood his pain. For Charlotte, the experience was a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she still had to go. Betrayal had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. As she walked along the shoreline that evening, the waves crashing against the rocks, Charlotte felt a strange sense of closure. She couldn't undo the past, but she could ensure it didn't repeat itself, for herself and for others. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't retribution, it's breaking the cycle. Revenge for betrayal. The final curtain life in the coastal town had settled into a rhythm, but Charlotte's journey was far from over. The betrayal she had endured and the battles she had fought had changed her in ways she was still learning to understand. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but some scars went deeper than the law could heal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ocean, Charlotte sat at her bookstore's small cafe. The peaceful, Setting was disrupted when Nathan walked in, his expression troubled. "I didn't want to disturb you, but something's come up," he said, taking a seat across from her. "What is it now?" Charlotte asked, her tone wary. Nathan placed a newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Victor Langston's Network. Corruption runs deeper than thought." The article detailed new allegations against Langston's associates, including names Charlotte recognized from Edward's dealings. One name in particular made her stomach drop: Margaret Price. Margaret had been a close friend of Edward and Charlotte during their marriage, someone Charlotte had leaned on during the early days of her business struggles. The thought that Margaret could have been complicit in Edward's schemes was a blow Charlotte hadn't anticipated. "I know this is the last thing you want to hear," Nathan said gently, "but Margaret was deeper in this than we realized. She wasn't just a bystander. She helped Edward set you up." Charlotte spent the night poring over the evidence Nathan had gathered. Emails, financial records, and meeting notes painted a damning picture of Margaret's involvement. She had acted as a middleman, introducing Edward to investors who were part of Langston's corrupt network. Worse, she had actively sabotaged Charlotte's attempts to expand her bookstore, ensuring it would remain vulnerable to Edward's manipulations. Anger and betrayal surged through Charlotte, but this time, she was determined not to let those emotions consume her. She had learned from her previous battles that revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about reclaiming control. The next morning, Charlotte confronted Margaret at a charity event. The elegant venue was packed with Valshyr's elite, but Charlotte had no intention of making a quiet scene. As she approached Margaret, the older woman's smile faltered. "Charlotte," she said, her tone overly sweet. "What a surprise." "Not as much as this," Charlotte replied, holding up a folder containing the evidence. Margaret's face paled as she skimmed through the documents. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. "Spare me the excuses," Charlotte said, her voice icy. "You were supposed to be my friend, Margaret. Instead, you sold me out to Edward and Langston." Margaret's eyes darted around the room, her composure cracking. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "Edward threatened me. He said he'd ruin my family if I didn't help him." "Maybe," Charlotte said, her voice softer now. "But you had a choice when it came to sabotaging me. You didn't. Just protect yourself. You actively hurt me. And for that, I can't forgive you." Rather than expose Margaret publicly, Charlotte took a different route. She worked with Elise, her attorney, to file a lawsuit against Margaret and others involved in Edward's schemes. The legal battle was grueling, but Charlotte remained steadfast, determined to hold everyone accountable. Margaret's fall from grace was swift. Once a respected member of the community, she became a pariah, her name synonymous with betrayal. Months later, Charlotte stood before a crowd at a local event celebrating small business owners. She had been invited to speak about her journey and the lessons she had learned. "Betrayal has a way of breaking you," she began, her voice steady. "It shatters your trust, your confidence, and sometimes even your identity. But what I've learned is that betrayal can also be a catalyst. It can force you to confront truths you'd rather ignore and push you to grow in ways you never imagined." The audience listened intently as Charlotte spoke about resilience, justice, and the power of reclaiming one's narrative. "Revenge doesn't have to mean destruction," she concluded. "Sometimes the best revenge is living well, standing tall, and refusing to let those who wronged you define your story." As she stepped off the stage, Charlotte felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer held her captive. She had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace whatever came next. And this time, she would write her own story.